3 minutes before the bells, with the whole square roaring like a furnace, I gave the order that no one in the city guard had given on Founding Day in living memory. I told my sentry to stand down from the parade line, turn his back on 100,000 celebrating people, and march to a cold stone corner where nobody was looking. I am the officer who gave that order, and I want to tell you exactly why I gave it. Because for 1/4 of an hour that morning, a still corner in the loudest festival of the year taught a roaring city how to be glad. My name does not matter much to the story, but you should know who was speaking, so I will tell you. I held a captain's rank in the King's City Guard, and on the Founding Day I am describing I had the command of the Lantern Square Detachment. 42 men in red wool and tall black bearskins set out around the great cobbled square below the old Cathedral of Holloway, in the fictional realm I served, on the brightest morning of a long, bright autumn. 42 men to hold a line against joy. That is harder than it sounds. A crowd that has come to be happy pushes the same as a crowd that has come to be angry. It simply smiles while it does it. I had been a soldier 30 years by then and a captain for 9, and I had buried more of my men than I cared to count on any morning, let alone a feast morning. I tell you that now because it is the hinge of everything. A festival is a wonderful thing and a terrible thing in the same hour, depending on what you have lost. The same trumpet that lifts one man's heart drops a stone into another's. I had learned that the hard way, standing at the edge of cheering squares with a list of names folded in my breast pocket. So when I walked the line that morning at 9:30, with the bunting snapping and the smell of roasting chestnuts and the children up on their father's shoulders, I was glad, truly glad, and I was watching the quiet ones at the back who had not come for the chestnuts. Founding Day in Holloway was the great festival of the year. The story the city told itself was 300 years old, that on this date the first stone of the cathedral had been laid, the river wall raised, the city saved from a flood that had nearly carried it off, and a charter granted that made free men of laborers. None of that need be true to the letter for a city to love it. What was true was the joy. By 9 in the morning the square held tens of thousands. By the bells at noon it would hold 100,000, and the streets feeding it as many again. There were jugglers on stilts and a children's lantern parade forming up by the fountain, and a brass band murdering an old marching song with tremendous good cheer, and stalls selling honey cakes and ribbon and little tin soldiers that I am told outsold every other toy 3 to 1, which my men found very funny and I did not. And in the northeast corner of that square, where the cathedral's oldest wall met the buttress and the morning shadow lay longest and coldest, there stood a thing most of the crowd walked past without a glance. It was a memorial, a low slab of gray stone worn smooth, with a shallow bronze bowl set before it and a short rail of black iron around it, no taller than a man's knee. On the slab were carved no names because there were too many for any slab, only a single line, cut deep and filled with lead so the years would not eat it, for those who cannot be here. It had been raised, the cathedral said, by the same charter that founded the festival, set there from the very first Founding Day so that the city in the middle of its gladness would keep one cold corner for the ones the gladness was bought with, and the ones the gladness had passed by. The drowned of the old flood. The men who died raising the wall. And as the centuries rolled on, everyone after, every soldier, every sailor, every mother in childbed, every soul the city had lost in the year just gone, named or nameless, remembered or forgotten. Most years, I am sorry to say, the memorial corner stood empty through the whole feast. The crowd flowed around it the way a river flows around a stone, and the bronze bowl stayed dry, and the shadow stayed cold, and the line cut in the slab went unread. It is no one's fault. Joy is loud and grief is quiet, and a quiet thing in a loud place becomes invisible. I had stood in that square on 9 Founding Days as a captain and watched it happen 9 times, and each year it had sat a little heavier on me, though I could never have told you why exactly until the year I am telling you about. That year the cold corner was not empty. I saw her at 9:20 when I made my second walk of the line. She was an old woman, very small in a good black coat gone gray at the cuffs, and she was standing at the iron rail of the memorial with both gloved hands folded on the top bar, perfectly still, while the festival thundered 10 feet behind her. She had brought a single sprig of something, rosemary, I think, the herb the old families bring for remembrance, and laid it in the dry bronze bowl, and she was looking at the line cut in the stone as if she were reading it over and over. Nobody was near her. The crowd had left a little island of empty cobbles around the rail, the way crowds do around grief without ever meaning to, without even seeing it. A boy on stilts went by laughing. A ribbon seller called her wares. The old woman did not turn her head. She stood at the rail in the cold shadow with her rosemary in her folded hands, and she was the loneliest thing I have ever seen in a crowd of 100,000, and I am not a man given to that kind of sentence. I want to be careful here because the easy thing would be to make her a symbol, and she was not a symbol. She was a person. I learned later, it does not matter how, that she had lost her son in the spring, a young man who had served in the King's regiments and had not come home from a posting on the eastern border, in a quiet sort of dying that gets no festival of its own, and that she had no other family living, and that she had come to the memorial on Founding Day every year since, alone, to stand for a while in the only corner of the city that had been set aside 3 centuries before for exactly her. She did not know that. She thought, I imagine, that she had simply found a quiet place. The truth is the city had built her that quiet place on purpose and then forgotten for 300 years to honor it. I stood at the head of my line and watched her, and I did not yet know what I was going to do. I only knew that something was wrong and that the wrongness was not in her. The wrongness was that 100,000 people were going to be glad all morning beside a stone that said for those who cannot be here, and not one of them was going to look at it, and the one who did was going to stand there alone. The festival was not wrong. The corner was not wrong. What was wrong was that the city had let them come apart, had let the joy forget what it was built on, and let the grief stand by itself in the cold. And I was the officer on the ground, and the corner was inside my detachment's line, and that, whether I liked it or not, made it mine. Now I must tell you about Sentry Corwin, because he is the second half of this story, and in many ways the better half. He was the third man from the cathedral end of my line, posted not 10 yards from the memorial corner, facing out into the square as all my sentries faced, eyes forward, rifle at his shoulder, bearskin square, white gloves flat at the seam of his trousers. A ceremonial sentry of the King's City Guard in the full discipline of the post, which is to say a man who had trained himself not to move, not to speak, not to so much as let his eyes drift, no matter what the square threw at him. And the square threw a great deal at a sentry on Founding Day. Children waved tin soldiers in his face. Tourists pressed in to be photographed. A man with too much festival ale in him had, an hour before, tried to put a paper crown on Corwin's bearskin, and Corwin had not so much as blinked, and the man's friends had hauled him off, laughing, and Corwin had remained exactly what he was, a still red figure in a roaring gold morning. I knew Corwin a little. He was a quiet man even out of the uniform, a man in his middle 30s with a level gray gaze and a way of listening that made you choose your words. He had served on the eastern border himself, years before, in the same regiments, before he had come into the city guard. I did not know not then that he had stood beside the old woman's son in his very first posting, had trained the boy, had written, when the boy fell, one of those letters an officer writes that no letter can carry. I did not know that the name not carved on that slab because no name was a name Corwin knew. I would learn it later, and it would change how I understood the whole quarter of an hour. But standing at the head of my line at 9:20, all I knew was that I had a still man 10 yards from a cold corner and a lonely woman at the rail, and a decision sliding toward me that I had been 9 years not making. The bells were to ring at noon. Between now and then the square would fill to bursting. The King's Herald would read the old charter from the cathedral steps, the lantern children would parade, the band would play the founding hymn, and 100,000 people would lift their voices and be glad. And the cold corner would sit in its shadow, and the old woman would stand at her rail, and at some point, having stood as long as a heart can stand alone, she would go home through the crowd unseen, and the festival would never know she had been there at all. I had let that happen 9 times. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why I did not let it happen a 10th. I would like to tell you it was pure honor, a clean, clear sense of duty rising up in me. It was not that simple. Part of it was the names folded in my own breast pocket. I carried, that morning as every morning, a worn paper list of the men I had lost under my command over 30 years, 61 of them, and I read it every dawn, and not one of them was on that slab by name because no one was, and yet all of them were, because the slab said for those who cannot be here, and that is exactly what they were. Part of it was the old woman. And part of it, I will be honest, was 9 years of watching and saying nothing, which is its own kind of weight, and which had finally grown heavier than the fear of doing something irregular on the most public morning of the year. Because what I was contemplating was deeply irregular. A ceremonial sentry does not leave his post. That is the first law of the thing he is. The whole meaning of him, the still red figure that the children point at and the tourists photograph and the city loves, is that he does not move, that he stands his post through anything, that the post is the point. To order a sentry off the parade line in the middle of Founding Day, in full view of the assembling crowd in the cathedral and the King's Herald, to march him to a corner most of the crowd did not even know was there, that was the kind of thing that ended careers, and rightly, if it were done for a foolish reason. The discipline of the post is not a small thing to set aside. It is one of the great things, and a captain who treats it as small should not be a captain. So I did not treat it as small. I stood at the head of my line for a long time, 5 minutes, 10, and I weighed it the way you weigh an order you will have to answer for, and I asked myself the only question that mattered, which was not, is this irregular, but is this what the post is for? And there, finally, was the answer, and it had been there the whole 9 years. The post is not the point. The post is the means. The point is the thing the post stands for. A sentry stands his line so that the city beneath him may be safe and free and glad. That is the duty, that is the honor, that is why we put a man in red wool and teach him not to move. But a city that is glad beside a forgotten grave is not the thing the post is for. It is the thing the post fails at. The discipline of standing still is the highest discipline I know, but it is not the highest duty. The highest duty is the reason for the discipline. And on that morning, with that woman at that rail and that line cut in that stone, the reason for the discipline and the discipline itself had come apart, and I was the officer standing exactly at the seam, and I had to choose which one to serve. I chose the reason. I walked the line to the cathedral end, slow and square, the way an officer walks when he does not want 42 men to feel anything change. I came up behind Sentry Corwin, close enough to speak under the noise of the square, and I gave him his order in the low, flat voice we use for the things the crowd is not meant to hear. "Sentry," I said, "there is a woman at the memorial rail, northeast corner, in a black coat. She has come to remember someone. The whole square has come to forget. I am ordering you off the parade line. Ground arms at the corner, stand at the memorial, and render honor to the stone and to whoever she has lost. You will stand the memorial as you would stand any post, full discipline, full bearing. You will not speak to her unless she speaks first. You will hold that corner until I relieve you. Do you understand the order?" I felt him understand it. I cannot describe it better than that. He did not move. A sentry under orders does not move until the order is to move, but something went through him, a kind of settling, the way a still pond settles deeper when a weight is laid gently on the ice. And then, very quietly, not turning his head, he said the only words he said to me that whole morning. Yes, sir, thank you, sir. The thank you stopped me for half a breath. I did not understand it yet. I understood it an hour later when I learned the name. He was thanking me, though I did not know it, for ordering him to do the one thing he had wanted to do for 9 years of founding days and could not, because no one had ever told him he was allowed. I stepped back. Corwin came to attention, the full attention, the heels together, the snap that even in a roaring square you can somehow feel more than here, and then he turned out of the line. I have watched men march 10,000 times. I have never watched a march like that one. He came off the parade line and turned 90 degrees and marched across the open cobbles toward the northeast corner, slow march, the deep ceremonial pace, each boot lifted and set with the full weight of the discipline, his rifle at his shoulder, his bearskin square against the gold morning. And the strangest thing happened, the thing I have never been able to fully explain. The crowd noticed. A red sentry does not usually draw a crowd's notice by moving, because a red sentry is the thing that does not move. That is precisely why a moving one snags the eye. People turned. Not all at once, a few near the line first, then more. A ripple of turned heads spreading outward the way a dropped stone spreads a pond. A ceremonial guard had left the parade line. Something was happening. Phones came up. Children were lifted higher. Where is he going? What is he doing? The slow red figure marched across the open cobbles toward the corner nobody had been looking at, and because everyone was now looking at him, everyone was now, for the first time in 300 founding days, looking at the corner. They saw the old woman at the rail. They saw the gray slab. And as Corwin reached the corner and halted, a hard, beautiful halt, both boots ringing together on the stone, they began, the nearest of them, to read the line cut in the slab over his shoulder. For those who cannot be here. I watched it cross their faces. I watched a young man with a honey cake halfway to his mouth lower it slowly. I watched a mother turn her child gently around so the child would not point. The old woman had turned at the ringing of the boots. She was looking at Corwin now, her gloved hand still folded on the rail, her face. I was close enough by then to see it, her face doing something I will not try to put into easy words. She did not know what was happening either. A red guardsman had marched out of the most glorious parade in the kingdom and come to her corner and halted 3 feet from her stone. I think for a moment she was afraid she had done something wrong, that she was in the way of the festival, that she would be moved on. People who carry a grief into a celebration often feel that they are in the way, that their black coat is an offense against the bunting. I have seen it. It is one of the cruelest small cruelties there is, and the city had been doing it to her by neglect for years. But Corwin did not move her on. Corwin grounded his arms. He brought his rifle down from his shoulder in the slow ceremonial drill, set the butt on the stone, and stood it before him with both white gloves on the muzzle, and then he bowed his head over it, the deep, formal, motionless bow of the vigil, the bow a guardsman makes over a casket, the bow that says I am standing here for this, and I will not stop. He bowed his head to the gray slab, to the line cut in the lead, to whoever the old woman had lost, to all of them, to every soul that could not be here. And he held it. And the festival, 10 feet away, went quiet in a circle that widened and widened. I want to be exact about the quiet because it was not the quiet of the whole square. 100,000 people do not fall silent for one guardsman, and they did not. Out past the fountain the band still played and the jugglers still juggled and the honey cakes still sold. The quiet was local, a pool of it around the corner, perhaps 30 feet across at first, and within that pool people took their hats off. I did not tell them to. Nobody told them to. A man near me, a big workman in his festival best, simply reached up and took his cap off and held it against his chest, looking at the bowed red figure and the gray stone, and the man beside him saw it and did the same, and it spread the way the turning of heads had spread, a ring of bared heads around a still corner in a roaring city. I have ordered men to present arms 1,000 times, and never felt anything like watching strangers uncover their own heads, because one disciplined man bowed his. The old woman was crying. Not loudly, she was not a woman who would ever cry loudly, but the tears were running freely down her face now, and she had stopped trying to hide them, which is its own kind of permission. She was looking at Corwin's bowed bearskin and at the slab beyond it, and I understood, watching her, that the thing that had broken in her was not grief, which she had carried in already, but something nearer to relief, the relief of not being alone with it. For perhaps 11 founding days she had stood at that rail by herself in the cold corner, while the city was glad behind her back. And now, a man of the king's own guard had left the most honored line in the realm to come and stand with her, to bow his head to her boy and to all the boys, and she was not the only one in the city, that morning, who remembered. That is the whole of it, really. That is what the still corner did. It did not stop the festival. It did not scold the joy. It gave the grief a place inside the joy, and in doing so it gave the joy a floor to stand on. I have come to believe that a festival without a memorial corner is a shallow thing, a child's idea of gladness, gladness that has never lost anything, and so does not know what it is glad about. And a memorial without a festival is a hard, cold thing, grief that has forgotten there is anything left to be glad of. The two need each other. The old charter had known that 300 years before, when it set the slab in the square on the very first founding day, side by side with the bunting. The wisdom had been there in the stone the whole time. The city had simply stopped reading it. And it took one captain's irregular order, and one sentry's slow march, and one bowed head, to make 100,000 people read it again. Now I must tell you what I did next, because an officer who starts a thing must see it through, and a thing half done in public is worse than not done at all. I did not leave Corwin standing there alone with the woman and the widening ring of bared heads and the phones. That was not enough, and it could too easily have curdled into a spectacle, which is the opposite of what honor is. A spectacle takes from the grieving, honor gives to them. The difference between the two is whether you make the moment about the watching or about the lost, so I walked into the ring myself. I came across the open cobbles to the corner, a captain in the field uniform of the guard, my own bearskin under my arm now, bareheaded like the crowd, and I came up beside Corwin at the rail, facing the slab, and I came to attention beside him, and I bowed my own head over the stone. Two of us now. The captain and the sentry, side by side at the cold corner, bowed to the line that said for those who cannot be here, while the festival pooled into silence around us. And then I did the one thing I had decided, standing at the head of my line, that I would do if I did anything at all. I took the worn paper list from my breast pocket, the 61 names of the men I had lost in 30 years, and I unfolded it, and I laid it in the dry bronze bowl beside the old woman's sprig of rosemary, and I bowed to it. I had carried those names every dawn for 9 years past that square, and never once thought to give them their corner. The slab had been built for them. It had been built for her boy. It had been built for every name nobody carved because there were too many, and on that morning, for the first time, I gave mine the place that had been waiting for them for 3 centuries. I heard the old woman draw a breath beside me, and then, in a voice rusty with disuse and tears, she spoke, the first words anyone had spoken at that corner that morning. "You knew him," she said, but she was not speaking to me. She was speaking to Corwin. I did not understand. I looked at her, and then I looked at Corwin, and I saw that the sentry's discipline, the iron, motionless discipline that had stood a paper crown and a square full of cameras, and in order to leave the most honored line in the realm. That discipline was, for the first time all morning, costing him something to keep. His head was still bowed. His gloves were still flat on the muzzle. But a single line had appeared at the corner of his jaw, the tell of a man holding his face by main strength, and I understood that the woman had recognized him, or recognized something in him. The way the grieving sometimes recognize the one other person in a crowd who carries the same weight. "You wrote me the letter," she said. "I kept it. I know your hand." And then, very softly, a name, her son's name, which I will not set down here, because it belongs to her and to the slab and to whoever could not be here, not to a story. And she said the name, and Corwin's bowed head moved, the smallest fraction of an inch, a nod, yes, and the old woman put her gloved hand on the iron rail nearest him and held it there, not touching him, because you do not touch a man on duty, but as near to him as the rail allowed. And the two of them stood there bowed over the boy that one had born and the other had buried. I had not known. I want to be clear that I had not known when I gave the order that the sentry 10 yards from the corner had stood beside that woman's son on the eastern border, had trained him in his first posting, had been the officer who wrote the letter when the boy fell, and had carried that name, one name, the way I carried 61 through every dawn since. I had given the order for the woman and the corner and the 9 years of watching. I had not known I was also giving it to Corwin, that I was handing a man the one thing he had needed for a year and could not ask for, leave to stand for his soldier in the open in front of the city on the day the city was glad. The thank you, sir, made sense to me now. He had been thanking me for that. This is the part I find hardest to explain, and the part I most want to get right. A ceremonial guard's whole art is the keeping in. He learns to feel everything and show nothing, to carry the weight and not let it bend the bearskin a hair. We train it into them on purpose. It is the discipline that makes the still red figure the still red figure, and it is a true and high discipline, and I will defend it against anyone who calls it cold. But it has a cost, and the cost is this. A man who has trained himself to show nothing must still, somewhere, put the weight down, or it crushes him. And we do not always give him the place to put it down. We give him the post, and the post is the keeping in, and we do not always remember to give him, somewhere, the corner where he is allowed to set it on the ground. That was what the order did for Corwin. It did not break his discipline. He stood the memorial in full bearing, every line of him correct, and any general who saw him would have passed him without a word. But within the discipline, for the first time, he was standing for the thing the discipline was for. He was not keeping the weight in beside the corner. He was setting it down on the corner where it belonged, where the stone had been waiting 300 years to take it. And the bowed head and the line at his jaw were not the discipline failing. They were the discipline finally, after a year, being allowed to mean what it had always been for. The ring of silence around the corner had grown wide, now 60 feet 80, and at its edge the festival still ran on, and the two things, the joy and the quiet, were not fighting. They were leaning on each other. I could hear the band over by the fountain playing the founding hymn, the same tune they murdered every year, and for once it did not sound like cheerful noise. It sounded like a hymn. The corner had given it back its meaning. A song of gladness sounds different when it is sung within sight of a stone that says for those who cannot be here. It stops being a song about how nice the morning is and becomes a song about how dearly the morning was bought. And that is a far better song, and it had been the same notes all along. It was nearly noon now. I could feel the square gathering itself for the bells and the herald, the way a crowd does, a kind of held breath running through 100,000 people at once. In a moment the great doors of the cathedral would open, and the king's herald would come out onto the steps and read the old charter, as he did every founding day, the 300-year-old words about the first stone and the river wall and the free men, and the city would cheer. And here is the thing I could not have planned, the thing that made me believe, finally and for good, that the corner had been right. The herald came out. The doors opened and the herald came out onto the cathedral steps in his tabard with the great scroll, and the square roared, and he raised his hand for quiet and got it, the way you can only get 100,000 people quiet when they have come on purpose to hear a thing. And he began to read the charter. And I, standing bowed at the cold corner with my sentry and the old woman, was not really listening, because I had heard it 9 times. Until he reached a part I had never once heard in 9 years, because in 9 years I had never been listening at the corner, where the words were aimed. Because the charter does not only speak of the first stone and the river wall. It ends, it has always ended, 300 years, and almost nobody listens to the end, because by then the cheering has started. It ends with the founding of the memorial. "And we charge the city," the herald read, his voice carrying flat and clear over the hushed square, "that in the midst of its gladness it shall keep one corner cold, and set there a stone for those who cannot be here, that the glad may not forget the cost of their gladness, nor the grieving stand alone within the joy. For a city that remembers only its triumphs is a child, and a city that remembers only its dead is a tomb, and we will found neither. We found a city that holds both in the same square on the same morning, and is therefore neither a child nor a tomb, but a city of free men, who know what they have and what it cost, and who they owe." I had never heard those words. 300 years they had been read over the heads of a cheering crowd at the very moment the crowd stopped listening, and the corner they spoke of had stood cold and empty below them, and the irony of it, the charter charging the city to do the very thing the city had forgotten to do, read aloud every year directly above the forgotten stone, was almost too much to bear. The founders had known. They had built it into the founding. They had charged us, in the founding document of the festival itself, to keep the corner, and we had kept the festival and let the corner go cold, which is to say we had kept the easy half of what they asked and dropped the hard half, the way a man keeps the wedding and drops the marriage. When the herald reached "who they owe," he looked up from the scroll. And he was looking, I will swear it to my last day, at the corner, at the gray slab, and the bowed sentry, and the old woman, and the bare-headed captain, and the ring of uncovered heads around them. Whether he had seen us from the steps and changed his reading to aim it, or whether the words had simply, for once, found the corner they had always been meant for, I cannot tell you. I only know that he read the end of the charter to the memorial for the first time in 3 centuries, and that the memorial, for the first time in 3 centuries, was not empty when he read it. Then the bells rang. The great bells of Halloway, the founding bells, came down out of the tower over the whole city, and the square roared back, and the lantern children began their parade, and the festival rose up into its full glory, noon on founding day, 100,000 people glad together in the autumn sun. And the corner did not stop it. The corner did not have to stop it anymore. The two halves had found each other. The city was being, for one morning, the thing the charter had founded, neither a child nor a tomb, holding both in the same square. The joy was deeper for the corner, and the corner was warmer for the joy. And the old woman stood at her rail with the bells crashing over her, and her boy remembered at last in the open, in front of everyone, on the day the city was glad, and she was not alone in it. And that not the silence, not the bared heads, not the herald's words, that was the whole point, and it had been the point for 300 years. I held the corner with Corwin until the bells were done. Then I relieved him. I did it properly, in the full drill, because the proper drill was now the highest honor I could pay. I came to attention beside him, and I gave him the order to take up arms, and he raised his rifle from the stone to his shoulder in the slow ceremonial lift, and he came to the full attention, and then I told him, "Lo, well stood, sentry," which is the only praise we give and the highest there is, and he answered, "Sir," and turned and slow marched back across the open cobbles to the parade line, and took up his post, eyes forward, still as stone, a red figure in a gold morning, as though he had never moved at all. The crowd watched him go, and some of them clapped, softly, the way you clap at the end of a thing too large to cheer. But I did not leave the corner empty when he was gone. I had thought about that, too, standing at the head of my line an hour before. The whole failure of the 9 years had been the empty corner. So before I relieved Corwin, I had sent a runner to the relief detachment, and as Corwin marched back to the line, a second sentry marched out, and grounded his arms at the memorial, and bowed his head and stood it. And when his hour was up, another relieved him, and another after that, all through the long bright afternoon of the festival, so that, for the first founding day in living memory, the cold corner of Lantern Square was never once empty while the city was glad. We have kept it so every year since. There is always a sentry at the memorial now, the whole of Founding Day, in full bearing, bowed over the stone, and the bronze bowl is never dry anymore, because once the city saw the corner it could not unsee it, and people bring their sprigs of rosemary and their folded names by the thousand, and the ring of bared heads forms itself without anyone ordering it, and the herald reads the whole charter now, all of it to the corner on purpose, every year. The old woman comes still, while she is able. She is very old now. She stands at the rail with her rosemary, and there is always a red guardsman bowed beside her, and she is never alone in the cold corner again, and neither is her boy, and neither are the 61 whose names I lay in the bowl each year beside hers, and neither are the drowned of the old flood, nor the men who raised the wall, nor any soul the city has lost and could not carry home. They are all there, in the one cold corner the founders were wise enough to keep, in the middle of the loudest gladness in the realm. And the gladness is not less for it, the gladness is more. I gave an irregular order once, on the brightest morning of the year, and turned a sentry off the most honored line in the realm, and sent him to a corner nobody was looking at. I have given a great many orders in 30 years and answered for all of them, and I would unsay a few. I would not unsay that one. It is the truest order I ever gave, because it was the one that finally served the reason instead of the rule, and the post in the end was never the point. The post is the still red figure that the city loves and the children point at and the tourists photograph, and it is a fine and high thing, and I would defend it with my life. But it is the means. The reason is the corner. The reason is that the glad may not forget the cost of their gladness, nor the grieving stand alone within the joy. That is what the discipline is for. A man learns to stand still as stone so that, on the one morning it matters, he can leave the line he has never left, march to the coldest corner of the loudest square, bow his head over a stone that bears no names because there are too many, and stand in full bearing, costing him everything, showing nothing for those who cannot be here. I have watched men do many hard things in my 30 years. I never watched a harder or a better one than that. He never broke his discipline. He only, at last, let it mean what it was always for. And 100,000 people, in the middle of being glad, took off their hats to the cost of their gladness, and were gladder for it, and went home that night a little less like children and a little less like a tomb, and a little more like free men, who know what they have and what it cost, and who they owe. The corner is never cold anymore. That is the whole of what we did. We did not warm it with a fire. We warmed it by standing in it in the middle of the joy on purpose where everyone could see, and the city has never let it go cold since.